Okay, this is going to provide an overview of programming in Visual Basic. I apologize in advance, it's going to probably be a fairly long presentation. When you start in any new field, it doesn't really matter what it is, there's always a lot of new terminology to learn. And I'm going to be throwing a lot of new terms at you. You'll be exposed to them over and over again in the semester, but it's really important that you understand the terminology of the language so that you can learn to think like a computer programmer. Okay, the goals of this lecture is to, first of all, describe the process of visual programming design and in Visual Basic, explain the meaning of the term object-oriented programming, explain the concept, and again, these are some of the terms that I've warned you about, but you have to know about classes, objects, properties, methods, and events. This is the heart and soul of programming in Visual Basic. List and describe the 3 steps for writing a Visual Basic program. You will always use these same 3 steps. And describe the various files that make up a Visual Basic project. You'll see that when you start a new project, if you look in the Solution Explorer window, which we've talked about, you'll see all kinds of files listed. These are created by Visual Basic, and they're done automatically. You don't usually have to worry about them too much, but you should have some idea of what they are. Continuing with the objectives, I want you to be able to identify the elements of the Visual Studio environment. Now, we've already gone over that, the different windows that are there, but I want to talk a little bit more about that. I want you to be aware of the different phases of computer programming, the design time, run time, and of course, debug time if you make any mistakes, which I never do, but you might. You also need to know how to run a program, save a program, and print a program. I don't really see any need to ever print a program, actually, but every once in a while, I like to see it on paper, and you can if you want. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the errors that you might make, including a syntax error, which is an error in the use of the language, or a runtime error, which is something that happens while the program is running because maybe the user does something weird. And, of course, logical errors, which are the toughest to deal with. Okay, let's start learning some of these terms, and first we'll start with the idea of classes and objects. Now, you should know that Visual Basic is based on the most modern paradigm of computer programming called object-oriented programming, or OOPS. Sort of sounds like you made a mistake, and maybe after a few lessons you might think you did. It is designed to solve real-world problems, and so, in a way, it is designed to reflect what you find in the real world to solve problems with. The real world, of course, consists of many different objects. Now, when you run into a new object, there's a lot of things that you know about that object because you know what class it belongs to. This is much like the idea of a concept. So when you run into something new in the world and you recognize it as a member of a certain class, a screwdriver, a telephone, an electric range, I'm looking around the room and looking at what I see. I see all objects. I see a cell phone. Okay, that's what's in the world, and that's what's in our computer programming world. Objects that are members of classes. So when we encounter a new object in the world, we know a lot about it because we know what class it belongs to. So as I look around my room that I'm sitting in right now, I see a picture, I see a cell phone, I see dishes, I see bags, I see a refrigerator, and I know how to use these things, and I know about these things because I know what class of things they belong to. Now, I'm not in my own apartment right now, but I know how to use the stove because this particular stove that's in my kitchen right now is a member of a class of things called stoves, and we know about stoves. Let me give you another example. Take, for example, a cell phone, in this case, a smartphone. When you look at a smartphone and you look at its physical attributes and you say, oh yeah, that's a smartphone. Well, there's a lot of things you already know about that, even though you may not have ever seen this particular smartphone yourself. I think this looks like an iPhone because it's only got one button, which anybody knows is not enough. But even though I'm not an iPhone guy, I can figure out what this thing is. Now, if you were to ask me about this thing, I could tell you what its physical features are. And this, by the way, are physical features of all cell phones. The characteristics, we know that it's a member of a class of thing called smartphones. All smartphones have color. All smartphones have a size. They have a weight. They have a height. They have a width. Okay? And all objects that belong to the class of cell phones also have those same physical characteristics. So we can say, in general, smartphones have a characteristic called color. We can say that this specific object, this specific phone, is black. Now, in addition to talking about what it looks like, we can also talk about what it does. Well, how do I know what this does? Well, because I know it's a smartphone. I know I can make phone calls with it. I can play music. I can navigate. I can settle bar arguments by asking Google. Okay? How do I know that? All cell phones do those things. So I know how to use it. Now, here's a term that you need. Here are the terms that you need to know. The physical characteristics of an object are called properties. So all objects and all classes have properties. The things the object can do are called methods. Okay? Properties, methods, objects, classes. Very important concepts. Okay, this approach to computer programming is called the object model. Okay, now in VB you will create objects on forms that will do things and have physical characteristics. So when you create a new object, that object will have properties and methods and may also respond to events. So here's another term, an event. An event is something that happens to an object, and of course I'll describe that in much greater detail. Okay, to help you understand the difference, what these terms mean, objects and classes tend to be nouns. They tend to be names of things. A button, a checkbox, a menu, okay? Properties tend to be adjectives. Color, size, shape. The red button, the large button, okay, the square button. So they are words that tend to modify, you know. And again, this is not really how it's described in the textbook. This is kind of how I look at it. Methods are verbs. They're active words. They're telling the computer to do something. Some examples, and you don't have to know what they all mean right now. Show, end, clear, move. Okay, these are all verbs. They're actually doing something. You're moving something. You're ending something. Okay? Now here's an example. Let's say I take the sentence, park the red car, okay? Well, car is the object. Notice that in a different way, car is also the class. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, the concept, a car, is a class. If I'm talking about a specific car, that's an object, okay? Now, the car is red. That is a property of the car. Okay, and one of the things that you can do with the car is park it. That's a verb. Okay? Another key concept in the object model is the idea of events. Nothing happens in most Windows programs until you do something. For example, if you open up Microsoft Word, it just kind of sits there until you do something, like select something from a menu or start typing or something like that. Okay? So, for example, a user clicking a button. A user moving something. Those are things that the user does that may initiate some kind of action from the program. Now, you should think of classes as templates that are used to create new objects. So you have these classes of things, and some of them that we use in Visual Basic are things that you should be familiar with, like buttons, checkboxes, menus, so on and so forth. So when you want a button, a checkbox, or anything like that, you use the class as a template. Now the class definition, which you don't really see, contains all of the information that's available to that class. Okay, so we're talking about properties, methods, and events. Each new object that you create is based on a class. And so when you create a new object, it is a member of an existing class, which of course means we already know a lot about it. So if you create 3 buttons on a form, what you have done is you've created 3 objects or instances of the button class. So each button is an object. The concept of buttons is a class. So this is a key concept, and it's very important. When you create a new object, it inherits all of the properties and methods of the class. Okay, let me give you an analogy in the real world. And of course, keep in mind that analogies are slippery. Not exactly that, but this really does, I think, shed light on the whole idea of objects and classes. Let's take a class of things that you all know about. Automobiles, okay? Now, when I go to a new city and I rent a new car, I already know how to use that car. I don't need to be trained. Why? Because I know that that car, that specific object, is a member of the class of things called automobiles. So, for example, I know that it's going to have an engine. I know that it has a make, it has a model number, it has a color, it has a year, it has a height, it has a weight, it has a length, it has a width. How do I know that? All cars have those properties. What are some of the methods of a car? Well, remember, methods are verbs. Steer, start, stop, speed up, slow down. Notice again action words, verbs. Now, what are some of the events that cause things to happen in a car? Well, turning a steering wheel, shifting gears. I don't know if any of you remember what that is, but pushing the brake. These are the events that cause things to happen with a car. Now, when I see a new car, I don't need to be trained in all of these things. I know it already because it's a car. So, if we're talking about a specific car, like my car, my Toyota Camry, that is an object. But it is an object that we know a lot about because it inherits all of the properties, methods, and events of the class of things called automobiles. Notice, by the way, that there can be a hierarchy. So, for example, we can have a class of things called cars, and then under that we can have a class of things called sedans, and under that we have a class of things called Toyotas, and under that a class of things called Camrys. None of those things are actual objects. They're all concepts. So, and that's just kind of a future view of things. For right now, it's just important to remember that when you create a new object in computer programming, it inherits all the properties, methods, and events of the class of things that you're creating from. So if you want to know how to use it, what do you have to know? Well, you have to know the properties, methods, and events. That's called computer programming in Visual Basic. Now, looking at the same kind of concept here, but actually using Visual Basic, there's a class of things called buttons. Now, all of you have seen buttons before. When you open a computer program and there's a button, you have a pretty good idea what to do, okay? You know that it's going to have properties. It's going to have a name. Well, you may not know the name, but you're going to see text on the button, usually something that's going to be helpful in telling you what the button does. So the text on a button is a property of that button. The button could be different colors. It could be different sizes. How do we know that all of these things can be possible? Because it's a button, and we know about buttons. The object is a specific button on a form. So when I put a button on a form, I am creating an instance of the class of things called buttons. The button on the form is an object. The concept of button, that it inherits all of its characteristics from, is the class. Some of the methods of buttons: focus, hide, show. Again, these are all verbs. These are things that buttons can do. You may not know what they are, but you don't need to for right now. And events. Well, what are some of the things that buttons respond to? Well, I'm sure you've seen all of these things. A click, a double click, a right click. Sometimes the mouse going over the button is an event. So again, I know all of these things because I know I'm dealing with buttons. The whole really cool thing about Visual Basic is that you can create programs that look and act and work just like professionally written programs that you can buy, because all of the parts of a program are available in Visual Basic. So for example, radio buttons, picture boxes, labels, text boxes. You've seen all of these things, and when you write your program in Visual Basic, you will be able to actually create programs that look professional, that look like they were done by somebody who really knew what they were doing, okay? And this, by the way, is called a graphical user interface, or a GUI sometimes, and you are familiar with it from Macintosh and Windows and just about everything else. Android, everybody uses the same idea these days. Now, without spending a lot of time on it, as I mentioned, when you create a new Visual Basic project, several files are created and maintained by Visual Basic. I'm not going to go over all of them here in terms of what they do, but the main one that you have to worry about is the solution file, because that's pretty much got everything in it. But all of these little programs and application files are created by Visual Basic. You can see them in the Solution Explorer on the interface, but for right now, you don't have to worry too much about them. Okay, in Visual Basic, we're working in an environment called an IDE, or an Integrated Development Environment. And this is really cool because you do everything in one place. And nothing makes me feel older than saying, well, you should have been trying to program back in the old days, you know, when we had a separate compiler and a separate text editor and a separate debugger, and it was just really awful and it was terrible, and it's so much easier now. That, by the way, is all absolutely true. Right now, the only tool that you need to develop programs is everything you need is included in Visual Basic. So you have a form designer that will allow you to design the form visually and make it look really professional. You have an editor for entering and modifying code. That is the things that happen when buttons are pushed, or so on and so forth. You have a compiler, and we'll talk more about that in the future. A compiler is something that takes your Visual Basic program and translates it so that the computer can understand it. The computer does not speak Visual Basic. There's a debugger built in, so if you make a mistake, Visual Basic will find that mistake, will point to it, and will even help you correct it. Awesome. I mean, this is way different than old-time programming. An object browser, so that if you want to learn about the properties and methods of an object, you can browse through it. We won't be using that an awful lot, but it is available. And of course, there's a pretty profound help facility that will allow you to get help if you're having a problem. And of course, I'll be also supplying you with lots of resources for problems. Now, when you write a Visual Basic program, there are 3 steps. They are always done in the same order, and they always must be done exactly in that way. Again, this is very different than we used to do it in the old days. Let me tell you how we do it in Visual Basic. The first step in writing a Visual Basic program is to design the interface. That's what the user sees. That's the window that the user interacts with on the program. It contains the buttons, the menus, the checkboxes, and all of the things that are part of the program. You design the interface without worrying about how you're going to make that happen. You just make it look right visually. You make it look like a good program. Then we will later figure out what they do. Now, once you design the interface, you're going to have a bunch of objects on the screen, and for each object you are going to have to set properties. Now remember, properties are adjectives. They are the characteristics. So after you design the interface, you need to set certain properties. For example, every object that you create must have a name. The reason it must have a name is because you want to be able to refer to it. As I always say, you name objects in a program for the same reason that you name your children, so you can call them. Okay? So once you've designed the interface and you set the properties, now finally you're ready to write the code. And what you often find is there is not an awful lot of code to write, because Visual Basic does so much of the work. This is the complete opposite of the way that we used to program in the old days. In the old days, the interface design was considered an afterthought. You got the program working, And then, if you had time, you worried about making it user-friendly. Now, we start with making it user-friendly. We start with how it's going to look and how it's going to work. And then we worry about how it's going to work later. In this slide, we're going to discuss how to plan a project. The purpose of this course is really not to turn you into professional programmers or even expert programmers, but to teach you a little bit about how programmers think, because it'll help you understand computers at a much deeper level. So when you are presented with a programming problem, which you will be presented with in this semester over and over again, I'd like to give you some suggestions about how to think through the process of solving a problem. So let's take a look at a problem. A very simple problem, and one that is semi-familiar to you. It's the hello world in a different version. And the problem specification asks you to write a program that displays the message hello world in a label when the user clicks a hello button, and display the word goodbye when they press the goodbye button. The program will also have a third button that it will be marked end, and that will exit the program. People have problems with programming because I think it's kind of the same problem that they have with word problems in math. In order to understand how to solve the problem, you must decompose it. You must break it down into smaller steps. What I like to do is to think about input and output. That is, what kind of input is this program getting, and where is it getting it, and what is the output? Once I know what I have to work with and what output I need, I can think about the process. You probably learned when you took your first computer class that computers really do three things: take input, process that input, and provide output. And so programming, of course, mirrors that, because programming is telling the computer how to solve problems, okay? So let's look at a little chart that I put together. Now, I don't always put together a chart like this when I write a program, but it helps, and you might consider it. Again, the way experts program and the way beginners program, a little different. So I want to think about my inputs, okay? Now, how is the user going to tell the program what it wants what the user wants it to do? Well, there's a button. There's going to be a hello button, okay? So the program needs to have a hello button. There's going to be a goodbye button. Same thing. The program needs to have a goodbye button. And thirdly, there will be an end button. So now I know when I'm ready to actually design my program that I need 3 buttons. Okay? And that's the only input that we get. There's only 3 buttons. Now for output, there's really only going to be one label. Okay? And it's going to say hello when the hello button is pushed and goodbye when the goodbye button is pushed. But it's only one label, okay? Now, when the end button is pressed, there is no output. The program just ends. Now, once I know the inputs and the outputs, I can think about how to get from A to B, okay? So when the hello button is pressed, what process has to take place to place the label, the word hello in a label? Well, what we have to do is we have to send a message to the label saying, hey, display the word hello. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about what we mean by sending a message in a future slide. Now, when the goodbye button is pressed, of course, we want to send the goodbye message to the label. Pretty simple. And when the end button is pressed, what you have to do is end the program. And I'll just tell you what the code for that is. It's me close. Okay, so now I pretty much know what I have to do when I design the interface. I need 3 buttons and a label. Note that that means we have a total of 5 objects in this program. 3 buttons and a label, and the form. Yeah, the form's an object, okay? And for all of these objects, all 5 of these objects, once we place them on the screen, we need to deal with their properties, okay? So again, now I have an idea of what I need to do in terms of the program, and now I'm ready to head to the computer and get to work. Okay, in terms of the input and output, we know that we have 3 buttons for input and 1 label for output, okay? So what you're going to do when you open your program, you're going to see a form, and you'll see the toolbox. Remember our friend the toolbox that we have pinned? And so what you want to do is you want to click the button tool 3 times to create 3 buttons. and you want to click the label tool once to create a label. So that's pretty much what we need. 3 buttons for input, 1 label for output. Now, what you want to do is you want to visually place and size each of these objects on the form. You just do this with the mouse. You just move them around and you make them look pretty. There's no rule here. It's just visually appealing. It's visual design. So here I have a form in which I have placed 3 buttons, and I kind of lined them up and made them look kind of nice, and the label in the middle. Okay, so that's what you're going to want to do. So once you create the objects, you want to design the interface by placing the labels, the objects, where they belong. Okay, now we're ready for step 2, setting the properties. As you can see, we have a form nicely designed. Controls are where we want them. Now we're going to set some properties. Now, in order to do that, you're going to select the properties with your mouse from the properties window down in the lower right hand corner of your interface. Okay, now to select to set properties for a specific control, you merely point at it with your mouse and click it a single time. Notice that the properties window then indicates what object you have selected to set the properties for, in this case button 1. Now, one property that we will almost always need to set is called the name property. Again, when you create a new object, you have to give it a name so that we can then refer to it. Okay? Now, what you're going to do is you're going to scroll down the properties up and down until you see the name property. Okay? The names of the properties are in the left-hand column. Then what you're going to want to do in the right-hand column is type in the name of this specific button. Remember, this is an object of the class of buttons. Objects of the class of buttons have a name property, which we're going to set, and it's going to refer to that specific button. Now, this is the name of the button. This is not displayed anywhere. You don't see that on the button itself. Now, I'm calling this button hello because there is a specific set of rules that we use to name objects. These are not rules that matter to Visual Basic. These are rules that help us remember what we're doing. I require that you use certain conventions when naming your objects in Visual Basic. Again, these are names that you make up. Just like I said, when you have a kid, you have to name it. It's a name you make up. So button hello is a name I pulled out of my hat, but I used a certain kind of convention for how I formed the name, which we will learn a little bit later in this presentation. The other property that we want to set for the button is the text property. Now, the text property determines the text that is actually inside the button visible to the user. So what you want to do is you want to scroll down the properties window until you see the text property on the left-hand side, the left-hand column, and you want to change that to the word hello. Notice no quotes. Now, when you do that, you'll notice that on your form, the text in the button changes. It now says hello. Now we need to set the properties for the other 2 buttons, and we want to set again both the name and the text properties for each. So I'm going to give you the names and the text property, and you just fill it out on your own. And button 2 we're going to call button goodbye, and its text property will be goodbye. That's what it'll actually say inside the button. And button 3 we'll call button exit, and set its text property to the word exit. And here's what the form will look like. Now, you may have noticed here that I have perhaps resized the buttons a little bit. When you put the text in the buttons, you may find it's not quite big enough. And so you can go back a step to the interface design and do a little repair job, again, to make it visually appealing. Now, the label needs to have some properties set, and these, again, are all set from the properties window. So you single-click on the label, and you will be able to set its properties in the properties window. Now, in this case, we don't want anything to appear in the window at first, so just blank it out. The name we're going to give it is label hello goodbye, because it contains either message, and when I look at that, I say, oh yeah, I know what that does. It displays hello or goodbye. It helps me. We're also going to set the border style to fixed and auto size to false. I don't really think I feel like explaining that right now, but if you play around with both of those settings, you'll see exactly what they do. And your form is going to look pretty much like this when you're done. And you can see 3 buttons, hello, goodbye, and exit. And a label, which is where the output is going to go, and we're almost done setting the properties. Now, if you recall, we have one more object to deal with, and that's the form itself. The form is an object in the program, and as such, it has properties that need to be set. So what you're going to do is, you'll see that the default name of the form is Form1, but that's not a very user-friendly name, so we want to change it. And we also want to take a look at the text property. Okay, so the name of the form should be changed to adhere to the naming rules and to keep things consistent. And the text property is the text that appears on the title bar here. Okay, so we want to set that also. Again, by default it says Form1, but we want to make it more appealing. So what you're going to do is, again, click on the form, anywhere on the form, except, of course, on one of the controls. That means anywhere in the blank space on the form. And you will be able to set the name property and the text property for the form. And I will just give you those for now. The form will be called Form Hello Goodbye. The text will be the words hello, comma, goodbye. And that will appear in the title bar of the window. And that's all there is to it. Now, writing the code, of course, is what some people consider the hardest part, because you have to actually think, and I know that's, and it's more than that. You really have to do some problem solving. Okay, when the program runs, and think about any program that you've ever used in Windows, Microsoft Word, whatever, when you start it up, it kind of sits there, waiting for you to do something. Whether that is typing in information, selecting something from a menu, pushing a button, it kind of waits for you to select an action. Remember, those are called events. Now, one typical action might be entering text in a text box. Another typical action is clicking a button. Such actions, again, to remind you, are called events, and what you have to do is you have to tell the computer what to do if that event occurs. So if the user clicks a button, that's an event, what should happen? That's the programming part. These actions may be triggered. The events may trigger certain actions. They don't have to. For example, there's an event called mouse over. Well, that's usually not programmed. You usually don't want anything to happen if the mouse just happens to go over a control, but you could, okay? And what actions do take place are programmed by you. They're determined by you, the programmer. And that's why these actions, these little routines that take place when the user makes a selection, are sometimes called event handlers. In other words, they tell the computer what to do when this event occurs. Okay, let's take a look at the code. Now, one of the events that you should be very familiar with is the user clicking a button. And in this case, in the program that we're writing, there are 3 buttons, and the user is going to click one of them. So we have to program what happens when the user clicks a button. So to write the code, you double-click on the object. Now, remember, to set the properties, you single-clicked. But now you're going to double-click, and when you do that, you're going to be placed in the VB editor, which is where you enter your code. And it looks like this. As you'll see, it has a couple of keywords here, private and nsub, and all that stuff is done by Visual Basic. And the cursor is placed in the proper place, and all you have to do is write the code, which in this case is label hello goodbye dot text equal hello. So a little closer look at the window, and you'll see again the code label hello goodbye dot text equal hello. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you really think about it, it kind of seems obvious, right? What we're saying is take the word hello and make it the text property of the label. So the code says send the message, make the text property of label hello goodbye the word hello. Okay, now this term, by the way, sending a message, is a term that is used in object-oriented programming. We are actually setting the property of the label, which we did before, from the properties window, and now we're doing it from the code. This, by the way, illustrates the difference between setting a property at design time when you're designing the program and setting a property while the program is running as the result of a user action. Okay, design time versus runtime. So you can go ahead now and add the code to the hello goodbye button. The main programming in this particular example uses what is called an assignment statement. Okay, and it's very important that you understand that how the assignment statement works and how the computer interprets it. Okay, first of all, what it does is it assigns a value to a property. Now, if you look at the statement, you'll see the property that we're talking about is the text property. If you'll recall, that is one of our properties. Okay, more specifically, it is the text property that belongs to the object label message. And what we're basically doing is assigning this a value. So the text property of label message will become the words hello world. Now, it's important that you understand that in an assignment statement, the computer begins on the right-hand side of the equal sign and figures out what that is, and then it assigns that value to what's on the left-hand side of the equal sign. Okay? Now, in this case, what we are assigning to the text property is the literal string, hello world. Literal strings in programming are encased in quotation marks. So in traditional programming, this is called an assignment statement. In object-oriented programming, it's called sending a message to an object. May seem a little, kind of picky here in terms of terminology, but it is important. So in traditional programming, if I were to describe the statement that you're looking at, I would say this statement assigns the value hello world to label messages text property. In object-oriented programming, we would say send the message, change your text property to hello world to label message.text. In object-oriented programming, objects communicate with each other by sending messages. To end a program, you use the close method. Now, the close method is a method of forms. So what we're going to do is the method looks like this, the word close followed by parentheses. The close method is part of the frame class, which is basically the same thing as the form class. Notice that methods always have parentheses. This will help you distinguish them from properties which never have parentheses. So when you look at, object name dot something, you can tell whether it's a property or method by whether it has parentheses or not. To execute the method of an object, you write the object's name dot the method. Again, notice the parentheses. So again, that's the form that it's going to take. The object's name dot whatever the name of the method is and the parentheses. Now, the current form may be referenced by using the keyword me. It may seem a little odd to you, but in object-oriented programming, objects can send messages to other objects, and objects can also refer to themselves. And that reference is me. So it's talking about me, the object that is being programmed. And so the code is going to look like this, me.close, parentheses, parentheses. Again, you don't have to totally understand this, but what it's basically saying is, okay, me, I am going to close. I am going to use my, how do I do that? Well, I have a method for that. You don't need to, it's hidden from you. You don't really need to know what I'm doing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to close myself, thus ending the program. So now what you can do is you can double click on the exit button and add the above code. Now let me make a few remarks about the remark statement. Okay. Programmers like to leave notes for themselves in the program so that when they come back the next day or the next week or the next year, they can look at the code and they can see these little kind of notes that they have written for themselves. And these are a very important part of the program. Now, they're also called comments, by the way. And these comments or remarks provide an explanation for what's going on in the program. Now, they're non-executable. That is, they don't cause the computer to do anything. They're just there. They're there for me to go back and read. The computer ignores them. Okay? When you put in a comment, it'll automatically be colored in green in your editor, so you'll know it's a comment, and you'll know that it's being ignored by the computer. And it begins with an apostrophe. So once you put an apostrophe on the line, anything following that is going to be colored green and is going to be a comment or remark and ignored by the computer. Every program that you write in this class should use remarks. Now, I may not make that part of the program specification for every program, but let me tell you right now that if you do not use remarks in your program, it will be returned, and I catch it, it will be returned to you. And let me show you what I mean. All of your programs should tell me what the name of the program is, who created it, the date, and what the program does. And you can see here what I've done is I've just put that in the program using the apostrophe. You can see all of that stuff in green, ignored by the computer, but allows me or someone else reading the program, or you when you come back and look at it later, tells us exactly what this program is and what it does. Real programmers, by the way, use a lot more comments than I'm showing you. But it's very important, and remember, it's a requirement in this class that every program should use remarks. Now, as we named our objects when we designed the program, I told you that we had to follow a certain convention, and I didn't really explain it. I told you I would explain it later. Well, now is later. And so let me explain to you the rules that we will use in this class for naming objects. Again, this is not required by Visual Basic. This is required by Dr. Cafola. Okay, and you will follow these rules. And again, failure to follow these rules will result in your program being returned to you so you can fix it. Okay, it's important that we have these common standards because it helps me when I look at your program to figure out what's going on. So if you're having problems with your program and you ask me for help and you haven't used the naming conventions, I'm not going to help you. I'm going to say, no, you have to change the name of all your objects to follow the rules first. All of the names in Visual Basic follow the conventions of what are called identifiers in programming, which is you can't use any spaces or punctuation marks or reserved words or anything like that. A reserved word, by the way, is a word that has meaning in BASIC. So, for example, you could not name something text, because text means something in Visual Basic. You could call it my text or output text, but you can't call it by a word that is already being used by Visual Basic that has meaning. We use what's called camel casing. This is a standard, by the way, but just a standard. The program doesn't require it. So what we're always going to do is we're going to put, the first thing is going to be the type of object it is. A label, a button, a form, a text box, whatever. So that's the first part. The second part is something that is meaningful, something that will tell me what that label does. So in the first case, we have a label that gives a message. We have a button that exits. We have a form for data entry. We have a text box for payment entry. Okay? So these are, again, the standard conventions that we will be always using in this class. Here is a more complete list of the types of objects and how they are named, and examples of each. I'm not going to read these to you because I'm sure you can do that. But keep in mind, if you do not use these naming conventions for your VB objects, I will not grade your paper. Now, because some of us are still kind of stuck in the paper paradigm, hey, just made up a new term, paper paradigm. Sometimes we like to see our code printed out. I don't like to do this. I think it's a waste of paper. Hopefully, as you get to be better programmers, you won't do this very much. But if you need to print out the code, you certainly can. You just go to the File menu and choose Print, just like every other Windows program in the world. And this will print a complete code listing, and you can look it over if you need to. Okay. Now, when the code is printed out, if it gets to the end of the page, you know, you're printing a line, it gets to the end of the page, and it can't keep printing, it'll continue on the next line, and it'll put a little arrow symbol there to let you know that this is all one statement. You'll again see this when you actually do it. Okay, well, that's the end of the lecture, finally. So now you can go, and there are 4 homework assignments posted on Blackboard. They're all fairly simple, but I want you to get used to the process. And again, always remember the process. Plan, then when you actually go to write the program, step 1, design the interface. Step 2, set the properties. Step 3, write the code. I know this was a long one, guys, but sorry about that, but it is finally over. Have a great day.